and check to see that it's not soaking wet, and that'll tell you if you have an issue.
I think you should be a brick inspector.
Me?
Yeah. I feel like you get into it. Wet brick.
That sounds awesome. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Digital Brand Manager Rob Watsack.
Hey.
Kiley Jacques, Design Editor.
Hi.
And producer Jeff Rose.
Hello.
Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast.
Ooh, dramatic.
I was going to do my vampire voice to do the intro today because it's so close to Halloween, but
I want to hear that next time.
Should we
be careful what you ask for.
I know most people actually. I know people mostly listen to the podcast, but should we be wearing costumes on
yes,
Halloween?
I don't do
absolutely.
costumes.
Yeah.
No way.
I got just a thing for you, Kiley.
I'm sure you do.
Boy, we heard from a number of folks this week, and we always appreciate that. For starters, we heard from Andrew regarding our discussion about how to charge enough to do small jobs and how you find people to do those small jobs for you. He says, I used to charge hourly for small jobs, but people balk when you tell them your hourly rate. In the last year, I moved to a fixed price model. That is so much for every task or item on the list. There's a minimum charge to make it worth your while. If the job is a little larger, use a daily rate of, say, $1,000. If the job will take 2 days, $2,000 plus materials. If you think it's a 6-hour job, you charge a full day's rate because it's unlikely you'll find a small project to finish off the day. This pricing method lets the customer know the price up front, and they don't have to worry if you need to make a parts run or take lunch. Sometimes it will bite you, but for the most part, it works out great. And he has some examples of what he charges for stuff. So a ceiling fan installed up to 8 feet above the floor, $100. Install a toilet, $150. Install LVT flooring, $5 per square foot. What do you guys think about this?
I think it's a really interesting approach, and if he finds it works for him, I think it makes a lot of sense in some ways, you know?
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Sean Van Dyke, who had done our building business blog for a long time, has an article about this. He called Real World Advice for Pricing Construction Jobs, and he seemed to have a similar take on it. It was like, the first thing you need to do, and this is the hardest for some people, although Sean thought it would be easy, is estimate what you think it'll take to do different jobs. And he went as far as to say, a door on a second floor versus a first floor, he'd charge more because he has to haul the materials up the stairs.
Yeah.
And you got to go outside to cut trim and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
Seems like something you would need some experience having done enough of these jobs to price it right.
That's the thing that I find tough is that, I worked as a remodeling, as a carpenter for a remodeler for years, but I wasn't the one doing the pricing, so I wasn't keeping as close tabs on the hours as my bosses were. So you got to put some time in before you can know what it takes. Because I was working in my shop the other day doing some drywall, and I was like, I'm never going to be a drywall contractor because I could never charge enough money for the amount of time it takes me to do this.
So I would say even if you are a apprentice carpenter, pay attention and record it on your phone someplace how long it takes to do stuff, because this diary of information is going to prove invaluable when you need to ultimately estimate jobs, either for yourself or for a company you're working for.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I was a carpenter and when I started becoming a lead carpenter, I always felt like, any business person feels like it's a waste of time doing that busy work, but that's the stuff that makes the work pay off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're educating yourself for making more money later, I would say.
I wonder how he accounts for conditions that make it not an ideal installation, right?
So
you run into something, and then there's issues.
I started taking down your ceiling fan, and I realized you have aluminum wire.
Right.
What are we going to do?
Yeah, I mean, you have to obviously clearly put that on your, on your estimates that this is if it's remodeling work, there are conditions that will cause this
Yeah,
price to change.
I was going to replace your door and found out all the framing underneath it is completely rotted. So it's not going to cost the same. You need to manage your client's expectations, right?
Right.
Like, this is the best case scenario. It could only get worse. They're going to love hearing that.
Yeah, and the temptation is for I think for a lot of solo tradespeople that are just out there trying to get the job done is to just to keep moving and not think about the time that they're putting into it. And I think a lot of times we fool ourselves into thinking that we're making
More efficient than
more
we
money,
are.
and
Yeah.
making more money than we are. So it's like anything you do to keep track of that information while you're working, it also might encourage you at a much earlier time than you otherwise would have to improve your pace or to look for ways to find
Or more likely, charge more.
that too.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh, that took longer than I thought.
For
I would
sure.
say keep track of your bookkeeping and paperwork time too, because that's all part of it. And if you're not paying yourself for that, you should be.
Totally. That's the worst part of it.
Yeah, especially if you're not getting paid for it.
Yeah.
So we also heard from a West Coast listener. Still love the podcast and want to thank you off the bat, but feel it has gotten even more provincial since the departure of the original three. Broadening the audience by adding a novice makes sense to me, but overlooking or being ignorant of half the country's building practices does not. I think the magazine, by the way, does a much better job in this regard. Keep up the good work, but please strongly consider my suggestion to add West Coast representation. So I asked this gentleman, what are you talking about? And he sent me a photograph to help explain where he came from. And it's a copy of a map, and it's titled A Bostonian's View of the United States of America. And it indicates that the New England area has a far greater impact, both geographically and probably socially, than its small stature would indicate.
Or at least it thinks it does.
It thinks
Yeah,
it
and
does.
how old is that map? So I mean, this attitude goes back a long time.
Well, it's made to look old. We don't really know how old it is, but it's hilarious. It'll be on the podcast page. And I'm told that there are similar maps for other parts of the country. So if you're looking for a great gift idea.
That's true. I like that. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it.
But anyway,
Lots of people I could give that to.
he went on further after sending this photograph and a graphic that indicating, so if California were a world economy, right, there would only be 5 countries bigger than California's statewide economy. So he's indicating that we're leaving out a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the thing is, we certainly don't do it intentionally. I mean, obviously it's more convenient for us, since we mostly live in New England on the staff here, to hit up the New England contractors because we know them already when we're talking about projects. But one of our earliest editors of the magazine, Chuck Miller, started as a remote West Coast editor. And if you look at some early issues of Fine Homebuilding magazine, you'll see there's a lot of coverage from the West Coast. And
there still remains to be.
yeah,
In print.
Yeah.
And he concurs.
in print.
But most of the questions that we get come from people based on the East Coast. So
Well,
that has
so-
something to
At
do
least
with
in
it.
heating climates. They come from cooler places, for sure.
So here's the thing then. All of you Northeast listeners out there that are writing us questions, I'm sure if you go on your social media accounts, you've got some friends of yours that live on the West Coast, and why don't you go tell them, hey, if they got any questions about their houses,
We'd love to.
send us an email.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree, and we'll try and do a better job with that regard. He closed by saying, I know ice dams and bricks are important, but these topics are foreign to many of your listeners. And I believe that. And I think part of our Northeast-centered focus has to do with the building science has gotten its start in colder places because it's more a bigger deal there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
it's more complicated.
and we get a lot of questions regarding those things, but once again, we will try and branch out a little bit.
Yeah, and honestly, we try really hard to not live up to the joking name of the Fine Air Sealing podcast. So we're
More on that later. So we also heard from Lee in Bostic, North Carolina. Just want to take a second to say thank you for taking the time to make an awesome podcast. My wife and I started planning a new home construction a couple of years ago and finally started this past August. Our goal was to build a small, efficient house, and your podcast guided our decisions in many areas of the design. I've attached a few pictures. Thank you all for all that you do. And Lee has a little gable, rectangular-shaped house. Couldn't be more simple, right?
Yeah, I love it.
Elegant, right?
Yeah, really nice.
Nice
sharp.
overhangs.
It's a
looks
great
like he's using,
representation of a pretty good house.
Yeah, totally.
2.0.
Using zip system sheathing for an airtight envelope. Looks great, man.
I'm
Really
guessing
does.
was that maybe going to be an enclosed screen porch on the end there?
I think there is indeed a screen porch, and that would be lovely in North Carolina.
I'd like to see it when it's finished.
Did you hear that, Lee?
Yeah, send
So
us
keep
more
us
pics.
posted and send us more photos as it progresses.
Look at that land, too. Man.
What I love seeing about the Carolinas is this red soil, and it's not everywhere there, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, my wife grew up in Southwest Virginia where they got that same red clay, and she's like, you can't own a pair of white sneakers. As a kid growing up around there, like if you drive around her neighborhood, I've been down there many, many times, and where her parents lived, and the foundations are stained red, the cars' tires are stained red, and you can't wash that stuff off.
Yeah. I spent a year in West Africa, in Ghana. It was the same way, and I remember taking real note of that when I first got there because my feet were always red because, of course, you're wearing sandals.
We had the similar clay in Pittsburgh, and all I remember is like trying to shovel it, and eventually, occasionally, like it would stick to your shovel and it would sail out of your hand. We also heard from a listener. Well, I don't know if it's a listener. It says, "Hi, we are offering our domain name insulationadvisors.com. Are you interested in acquiring the same? Regards, Emily."
So random.
I don't.
I didn't know what to make of that.
I didn't know if it was a joke
Yeah, I
or
think
if
it's a joke.
or if it was spamming. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
You think it's spamming?
It's probably some marketing person. Yeah.
I thought it was great. We'll let you know on that, Emily. Is that maybe we should get that ourselves?
Yeah.
So you've taken up a new hobby.
I do have a new pastime.
Yeah, let's hear.
And it has me thinking about flooring and the acoustics of flooring and the...
It had me thinking, I'm glad you live alone.
So yeah, I'm into tap dancing now, and I bought this 3x3 floor with high-grade polypropylene and a vinyl top surface.
So this
And
is to
it's
tap dance on.
It's a tap dance on.
And it's
Made for that purpose?
It's made for that purpose. Now,
why can't you tap dance on normal materials?
because you really ruin the floors.
Okay, because you have metal
Yeah.
plates on your shoes.
Exactly,
Okay.
stainless steel plates, taps. And, I have wood floors, and
Right.
the temptation to get off of my vinyl and
just
onto the floor. I mean,
Do
the
Fred Astaire all over the place.
difference in sound is remarkable. And it's unfortunate that after, I think I've been doing this 2 months now, the condition of my tap floor is a mess. It's all pocked. It's stained with black. I don't know. You see the mesh sort of pattern
Yeah, what
that's
is that?
coming? I have no idea, but
It's the casting of the plastic underneath. Yeah.
I can't even get it clean. That's what it looks like after
you
I
wore it the
clean
heck out.
I wore it the heck out, and it wasn't cheap. So,
the question is what to do?
no, I just wanted to share that I'm
I
thinking
want-
about floor
No, but-
acoustics and durability.
I want to
and
get you a bigger floor.
I want to build the right wood floor.
Well, so now
Yeah.
Kiley does often does the product reviews for some of the design sections where we're reviewing materials for the magazine.
Yep.
Maybe you just need to get samples of like a dozen different kinds
Ooh,
of
put 'em all
flooring materials
together.
and put them together.
And get a
dance
patchwork
on one
floor.
corner for a while. Dance on
Is there a technical reason for having wood versus another material? Like, does it not work if you have something that's too high friction, for example?
Well, I've never tapped on anything other than wood, but I have noticed that when I'm doing some serious damage to the studio floor in my gym, and I need to stop going there to do it because I don't know what that flooring is, but
It's not up to the job.
it's really, I've done a number and I need to stop.
They're going to have you on tape.
Yeah.
You're going to get a bill.
I'm starting to wonder if, I don't know how many layers you want underneath the top surface in terms of protecting your body, right? Because
Sure.
there's a lot of impact there.
Sure.
So, but the sound of hard wood is just so nice.
Yeah, I believe it.
So, I don't know.
I immediately thought of like, why not concrete or terrazzo or something?
I think
of course.
that would be really hard on your body.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you just need to go to the local builder or cabinet shop and see if they have some scraps of like nice hardwood
E-Pay.
plywood or or something lying around, you could just keep running through.
Yeah, there's got to be somebody out there who's got some ideas for the ultimate tap dance floor.
Hear that, listeners? Kiley's got a request. That is definitely outside of my wheelhouse.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I'm alone here. That's for sure.
And you've been continuing to work on your barn to make it more energy efficient. Is that correct?
Yeah, as with all of us who are busy writing about construction and not doing it a whole lot, it's a long process. But I've mentioned my barn before. I built it like when I moved into my house in the early 2000s, and
It's impossibly cute, I'm going to say.
Thank you. It's
How wide is it, Rob?
It's
At the gable end.
inside dimensions are, I think, like 16 by 18, so it's not big. It's not big enough for me to have a full blown woodworking shop in there, but.
You need to scrape the paint off those window sash. That's driving me crazy.
Yeah, I did that just for you, Patrick. But so anyway, I built this barn years ago, and I never bothered to even close in the soffits. We talked about this, I think, on an earlier podcast. And finally, I'm getting around to doing some wiring changes and electric and insulating and eventually drywall to make it just cozy enough that I could throw a little heater out there when I want to work in the middle of the winter when I have all this free time and it's too cold to do anything else. And so one thing, prior to being a workshop, this was actually had a pool table in it that my neighbors all used to use, and they actually got really mad at me when I get rid of that.
But you couldn't convince any of them to take it, I'm sure.
No, I was the only person who had enough room for it. But so I had two big hanging lamps on, typical round boxes, lamp boxes and ceiling boxes over the pool table. And I was like, I got the switch circuit in here. I'll just run a bunch of, recessed cans like you would expect is just a nice simple.
Because they're cheap, too.
Because they're cheap. But I'm insulating. It's a shallow ceiling, so 6-inch cans don't even fit.
Mm-hmm. Nope.
And I was like, I don't really want to deal with all these holes in the ceiling. And
Plus, you guys are always discouraging people from using those.
Yes,
yeah,
that's
well,
true.
But in a workshop where you've got limited space, you don't want, I made 8.5-foot ceilings instead of 8-foot ceilings in this space just so I could move sheets of plywood around. And so having lamps sticking down from the ceiling is a problem.
Floor lamps.
Well, so no, what I decided to do is I swapped out those those boxes in the ceiling from the lamps with just 4 electrical outlets, square double box. And my idea is now there's these really nice cheap LED shop lights that look like the old fluorescent tube lights. And it's like $25 for like a 3 or 4 footer at Home Depot. And the one thing, especially with a small shop, that a friend of mine always says is like, you don't make everything movable, make everything adaptable. Because you never know how you're going to want it. You may put lights in a place, and then all of a sudden you find you've got this dark corner over here that.
Or you get a new machine that you need to change the lighting scenario to work around.
Yeah, so I figure I've only got 2 holes in the ceiling to air seal, and air sealing an electrical box is a lot easier than dealing with a can light. And then I can throw a couple of eye hooks in here and there to hold the chains or the cables that hang those strip lights wherever I need them, and just change it up as I need it.
What's awesome too is when you have one that quits working, it's so easy to replace it, right? There's like no troubleshooting. You unplug it and put a new one up there.
Yeah, but I mean the big takeaway is that I'm just trying to make this shop. I used to try to think, what's the perfect layout for everything, and no, make it a bare bones, simple box that I can just rearrange as my needs change.
It brings to mind a concept that is talked about a little bit on Green Building Advisor called the low road building. And I don't know what designer coined that term, but it refers to a structure that is not precious. It can adapt as your needs change. It can be altered easily and inexpensively, and it's just meant to be functional space. And
I would describe my house that way.
A low road building? I think that's awesome. That's how we describe our barn. And I'll put a link on the podcast page because y'all should read that. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
The MIT campus had one of these buildings, or maybe it was the University of Chicago. Anyway, but like a lot of really good engineering did there because nobody was paying attention to the students worrying that they were going to damage the building. So they actually worked on stuff. And when the building got replaced with an expensive, named building, then everyone was worried about what was going to happen to it.
Right.
So I don't know if I've mentioned this before because it's something I know I've talked about with other people, but a really extreme version of what you're talking about. I remember reading in some design magazine years ago, some Japanese architect built this house that was essentially a big warehouse with lots of nice windows, and all the rooms were like boxes on casters. So it's like if you wanted to rearrange your house, you couldn't just you weren't just limited to the furniture. You could actually rearrange your rooms.
That just sounds like fun.
It does.
Yeah.
I'd love to start moving it while someone were like milling around in there. So I enlisted Liam's help in a little project last week, and the idea was to put a big hunk of concrete in the ground so I could attach a guy wire to it for our shade cloth over our deck, right? When we lost all our trees in a big storm, suddenly our deck was unusable because it was so freaking hot. So on Amazon, we bought this shade cloth, and it's always had a big droop in it. So the idea was to put a cable across its middle so it would kind of drape like a butterfly, right? And that went fine. I taught Liam how to mix concrete. I let him dig the hole while I sat and drank a beer. Offered lots of helpful advice while he was doing that. And that was a great learning experience for both of us. But then when we went to mix up the concrete in the wheelbarrow, it had a flat. And I put air in it, but then it almost went flat immediately again. So it was this spiral of a project to replace the wheelbarrow wheel. I ended up stripping the steel handles of paint and repainting them. I found out that the little wedges that go under the tub were rotted, so I recut those and painted those with chassis black and bought a new wheel to the tune of $55.
Which you could have had a new wheelbarrow for.
I really questioned my judgment here, but it was kind of fun, and it cured me of my longtime desire to have a hobby vehicle because this polishing of rust and painting was plenty for the short term.
So the big question with a project like this is, do you have more time or more money, right? Because I know you found that to be tedious doing that job, but some people might actually really like that.
So I disagree. I found this to be kind of fun.
Okay.
I didn't. I mean, it took hours, sure, but like, it's better than sitting around.
Did Liam help you with it?
No.
And
I did use up some of the chassis black paint I bought for my motorcycle project that never got done. So all the stuff around the house, excepting the tire, which shouldn't cost that much. But what are you gonna do?
No, it should not.
So did you get the cable put up yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Guess what happened?
It broke?
So last night it broke. We had 3 inches of rain. The sailcloth filled up with water, and it snapped. I don't know where it broke.
Are you going to replace it with the same material or get something?
So I said to
sturdier?
Carol when I got it, I ordered it from Amazon sight unseen, and it was originally packaged as a system to hang outdoor lighting. And when I got the cable, it was very thin. And I was like, I don't know if this is going to work, but I decided to put it up anyway. So I don't know if the cable broke or the clamps came undone or something, but something failed.
So the thing is, and this is similar to Patrick and I were having a conversation, and we were watching some of the typical tree cutting fail videos the other day about how people underestimate the weight or strength of things.
Yes.
And I worked on a project not long ago. A contractor friend of mine was asked to put up this retractable shade cloth that it's like the shade cloth you probably have, but
It's
it
a
has
sunsetter awning.
this thing, I forget what brand it was, but it was a system that you run parallel cables off of the house to another rigid structure, and then
This thing
has
goes over
like
top.
little sliding bars that allow it to fold up almost like an accordion against the house. Well, that's great if you have another structure to attach it to, but we had this huge surface area, and it was on top of a windy hillside, and so we had to make sure this thing was strong. So
Right.
he put, I don't know, 10-inch. You know that big I-beam I have sitting in my yard? Have you seen that thing? It's like a 10-inch
Which
I-beam.
one?
He put 2 of these I-beams like 10 feet out of the ground, and they were like in the ground, in solid concrete, like, I don't know, another 5 feet. And he was tensioning the cables, and he was getting scared. So he actually had a friend of ours who
Had his friend do it.
puts up ropes courses for a living. So he's
Oh,
used to
that's
running
cool.
big, heavy cables. Who gave him, the specs for the right size cable. We were cranking that thing down. One end it was bolted into this timber frame house. The other end was it bolted into these 2 I-beams. We bent those I-beams 3 inches at the top.
Didn't anyone notice?
Well, I mean, like they were slowly getting drawn towards the house.
Man.
And that was with just 2 20-foot long, 3/8-inch steel cables.
So when I had this conversation with Carol, I said, well, Carol, the cable's rated at 350 pounds. I was like, there's never going to be that kind of load. Well, I guess water, yes, of course, weighs a lot.
Yeah, or wind. Even
Yeah.
if it's a porous shade cloth, you still have to be careful of the wind. Anyway,
It failed. Wah, wah, wah.
okay, let's get some serious questions here.
I'm ready. Hello, FHB podcast crew from Belleville, Ontario, Canada. Thanks for the great work you do. I enjoy listening to you tackle building questions, especially as your advice typically runs through the best, good enough, and if you feel lucky options for solving a problem. I became a magazine subscriber this year after listening to the podcast, and I'm looking at building a small 10 by 14 man cave / shed in the backyard to make a nice wood shop and use the equipment I've inherited, a drill press, planer, joiner, table saw, chop saw, etc. The space would only be heated when I work there. Okay, so can we stop right there?
Yeah.
How is he going to fit the drill press, planer, joiner, table saw, chop saw in a 10 by 14 space?
This goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Make sure everything's movable. Put
Okay.
it all on wheels.
Did you hear that, Matthew? That's a lot of stuff, and you're going to need space for the table saw to be useful, right? You're going to have be able to walk at least on 3 sides of it. He asked, will the tools rust in an unconditioned space like this? Quite often on the podcast, you speak of your own existing workshops that sound like they're mostly unheated. Do you have a problem with tools rusting?
So do you want to address that first? So
Yes.
So I
Yes, it'll rust.
the Fine Woodworking gang across the hall from us, they have probably a lot more experience with this stuff than we do. So I stopped by and talked to Michael Pekovich, who's not only their art director, but he's he built his own workshop and featured it in the magazine, and is just an avid woodworker out in that shop. And they deal with this all the time with their readers and their staff. And he basically said, any unheated workshop, you're just going to have that problem. The
In a
swings-
heating
Yeah.
climate, in a cold place. Yes.
Yeah, just swings of temperature in general.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a sunny day and the shop is still cool, you're going to have moist, cold surfaces in there where the moist air is going to condense on. So he said that they don't approach it from trying to prevent the moisture being in there, because that's
Impossible.
near impossible. He said they've just got a lot of tactics to deal with protecting the tools. So like small, finer tools like chisels and blades, they get packed away in an airtight container or a container with desiccants to help dry them out. You'd have a work like a toolbox that you'd close up, stuff like that, and they wrap the blades up so that they're not exposed to the air to stuff condense on them. And I said, well, what do you do for like the top of a table saw? I mean, do you spray? Because they did a review. I'll link to it on the different materials you could spray on surfaces
To keep them from rusting.
Keep them from
Yeah.
rusting. And
That was some great backyard science, by the way.
yeah,
I'm going to make sure we link that.
We'll definitely get that. But what he said is because I was like, what do you do for like a table saw? And he said any of the joiners, table saws that have these nice polished surfaces that are exposed to the air, they just cut pieces of MDF or other material that they could just lay on top of those surfaces when they're not using them to prevent them from getting the condensation.
And that'll raise the
on top
dew
of them.
point enough to stop the rust.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What about like on the body of machines?
Well, he said basically there's nothing you can do about that. So he said,
But they're usually painted.
but there's usually surfaces that are unpainted, like this sliding, wherever there's a sliding mechanism for
Yep.
adjustment on something that's usually a machined surface.
And that would you have to grease regularly anyway, so it would seem like that would be less
Yeah.
likely to rust.
But he said, just on a regular basis, people have to just deal with rust removal or just face the fact that parts of the chassis of the tools are going to get rust.
I would also say that like your precious chisels and hand planes, like take those in and outside as you need them. You don't need to leave that stuff out in your shed. It's, get a little toolbox or whatever you want to carry them in and take them back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My stuff, I keep anything that I value in the house during the winter. I will take it out seasonally when I know it's not going to get cold enough to make stuff rust, but I keep my planes and my chisels inside largely. And all my, I don't have a cabinet saw. My table saw is all aluminum. All my tools are meant to go to job sites, so they're fine.
Yeah.
They get left out in the rain on job sites, so they're going to be just fine in my shop.
Mm-hmm.
So my father-in-law, who was an amateur metalworker, knife maker, after he retired from his full-time job, built this little workshop. Sounds like a similar size thing here, and he used to have to use belt sanders that had these pretty fancy, expensive belts on them for grinding and polishing. And I don't know if it was a moisture issue or if it was a temperature issue, but he said that if he left them out there that they would degrade. And he said the solution that most of the guys that he knew would use is they built a cabinet, or they installed a cabinet that just had a light bulb in it. And it just, incandescent light bulb, which are getting harder to find. But you could probably put like some sort of small heater or something like that in a smaller space within your workshop to keep
Just make a conditioned space within the unconditioned space.
Yeah.
Cool. What do you have to add to this?
Not a lot. My tools are all rusty.
It's okay, right?
Yeah, it's just gardening tools. They're not But I think your suggestion of bringing what's really valuable to you inside,
Especially
is a
hand
good one.
planes
Yeah.
and chisels.
They cost
'Cause,
a fortune, right?
And if they get rusty, they're worthless.
Right. I did learn a valuable lesson, though, not to leave my paints and stains in my shed, because, of course, I don't want them in my house because they're toxic.
Sure.
But that was a
that doesn't
no-brainer.
Yeah, and you're not.
But I
gonna be-
didn't know. I'd never left them outside before, so.
He's not going to be able to leave his wood glue and stuff like that out in the
Yeah.
shed where it
Yeah.
can freeze. So
Same
you're going to have to
idea,
take
right?
that out in and out as you need it.
Yeah, again, a reason to maybe have a little heated closet where you store sensitive stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was that question. Sorry. What sort of foundation do you recommend for this building? I'm thinking of removing the organic layer of soil, putting down some stone, a layer of foam, and 6 mil poly for a thermal and vapor barrier, and then a concrete pad. I hate the idea of a wood foundation on blocks because of the step up, and I hope I don't need to dig a 4-foot frost/foundation wall, as that would be prohibitively expensive and take it out of my DIY hands. My main concern is frost heaving. Any thoughts on my plan? I'd be concerned about that too, Matthew, in Canada. But a frost-protected shallow foundation is a wonderful solution, and it's talked about in the IRC in section 403.3 for those of you who want to look that up and read it up for yourself. But it describes exactly what you're talking about, and it prevents the frost heaving that you're worried about. So
Is that originally Martin Holliday's design?
No, I think that came from the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense. I want to say that the Department of Defense actually commissioned the original research for their buildings to make them more cost-effective to build. I
So
believe.
he's just popularized the idea then?
Yeah, and now it's codified, and God, it makes a lot of sense to me.
We had an article, I think in the magazine quite a while ago, that was, rather than doing a frost wall all the way down, it was actually doing compacted stone
Yeah.
deeper, which is, the whole point is you're just trying to get a drained surface below the frost
So you don't
line.
have water freezing and moving stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, he's building a tiny little shop here. I mean, I missed the part where he said he didn't like the step up, but it seems like an awful lot of work just to avoid a step up. I mean,
But he might be wheeling things in and out. Maybe
so you build, like my shed in my backyard, if the ground's not perfectly level, you could always build it in a place where you can kind
Level
of
it.
Grade
knock,
down.
bring it a little bit below grade and then just have a little ramp if you need it, or just have it the door flush. But I don't think I would go through all the trouble for a tiny shop like that. But then again, he is having heavy equipment in there, so maybe
And he might
the
make it
slab.
bigger now that he's given it some thought based on
Yeah.
Patrick's recommendation.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the one tip for building a workshop is always make it bigger than you think you need it.
I think he needs at least like 40 by 60 for all this stuff.
That changes things.
I don't disagree.
Oh, boy. So we also heard from Tom from Ontario, who asked, Hi, FHB podcast. I live in a 1970s raised bungalow. Have you guys heard this expression, raised bungalow?
I'm not sure I have, no.
So I had to look it up. I'm like, what the heck is a raised bungalow? Well, it means a lot of things, but I think that's what most people call a raised ranch. But raised bungalow can look like a raised ranch, or it can look more like a bungalow. But anyway, the important part is that part of it is basement and part of it is garage in this case. The basement was partially finished sometime in the 90s. We're now looking to finish this off and improve the insulation and air sealing. The existing insulation is fiberglass batts and 2x4 walls, which are set 2 inches off the foundation, together with a poly vapor barrier. The rim joist is insulated with paper-faced batts in some places and uninsulated in others. The plan for the walls is to remove the existing batts and poly, add 2 inches of EPS on the foundation, spray foam the joints and connections, then replace the batts. The rim joist will be done with cut and cobble. However, there is a 12-foot length of one foundation wall, which is brick-faced. A cross-section is shown in the attached diagram. Your great discussion a while back about the perils of insulating structural brick got me thinking about brick drying path in this case. So my question is about insulating air sealing the rim joist and surrounding area on this wall while still allowing a drying path for the brick. Does the brick need a drying path to the interior? I don't know. It's like,
Doesn't brick dry to the exterior?
it should.
Well, so the thing is, the danger is especially in colder climates, is that if you have masonry walls that can absorb moisture, and you insulate them on the inside, then you can start having ice damage.
Right.
Spalling.
Yeah. But the thing is,
So let's
Yeah.
go. Let's continue with that. So the solution is to not insulate that spot and let some of the heat from the building keep the water from freezing behind the brick. Is that correct?
so that
Or in the brick?
that's true, but you don't necessarily have to not insulate. It's just that you don't want to over insulate. Like I've seen Joe Stieber talk about this a bunch of times, where when you're dealing with mass wall, masonry mass walls, that they'll do just enough insulation on the inside to allow some heat to go through to the S. So you kind of have to find a happy medium there. Another thing is like the whole drying to the inside thing. I mean, he did a little drawing of his brick. He's not talking about a brick structural wall.
Right. It's talking about veneer.
Brick
Yeah.
veneer wall. So if the veneer wall is detailed right and it's over a concrete foundation
With weep holes.
hopefully it's draining and
Yes.
drying, and
the risk is much lower than in a
Sure.
masonry wall.
plus he's also talking about using EPS foam on the inside, which generally is reasonably
Yeah, it's like
vapor open.
I think it's like 3 or 5 perms at 1 inch, so
Yeah.
it'll let some moisture go through.
Seems
Yeah.
like you often see the recommendations for exterior insulation on masonry, but that would take away the whole look of it, right?
Well, so as
what
a
do you do
as a
then?
retrofit thing, you mean, where people are trying to do it? Yeah, so like
That is the recommendation, but yes,
Right.
it looks bad.
yeah, I can't put my head around what you would do to. I mean, you lose the whole look, right?
Yeah, it doesn't look
yeah,
like brick anymore.
Right.
You're basically cutting your losses. Is what you're doing. It's like if you really want a super insulated masonry wall, it needs to be insulated on the outside in a cold climate.
Yeah, which you would never do here because it's just strictly veneer, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
So
it's
and
a small
I-
section.
So I think his concern about putting the EPS on the inside in that location isn't as big a deal as he thinks it is, and he mentions spray foaming the joints in the EPS, but we should check out the Martin's tape test thing to find out which tape works the best on foam. But I'll put a link to that.
So I love those tapes. They're very expensive. You can buy like a whole case of foam for about $120.
What's the environmental penalty difference, though?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't have that matrix handy, but I'll
And
get
also
that.
what's the guarantee that foam is going to stay, air? I mean, foam shrinks and gets hard and brittle, and I don't think it's always the best choice for air sealing.
Oh, okay.
You don't like that?
It's fine.
I think it's the first time it's been said on the podcast.
All right. We've been in the house for 2 years, and so far, no signs of any water issues in the basement. We're in Central Ontario, Zone 6. Thank you very much for putting together such an informative show. I hope that's helpful. Don't worry too much about that.
I came across Martin Holliday's article, Insulating Old Brick Buildings, and he touches on insulating the beams and joists. And he said you can inject the wood with borate salts to preserve it. You can insert metal wedges to conduct heat to the end of the beam. You can install hot water pipes to heat the end of the beam. And almost all of these solutions are problematic.
So I think... and I don't know what that particular article is, but there's obviously a risk when you have framing members that are let into masonry walls for all these reasons, and that gets to be a little of greater concern, right? You don't want your joist end rotting off and having structural failures.
Yeah, and if you have, especially in an older home where you have non-pressure treated sill plates, anytime you insulate your rim joists, your band joists, you're making... make it harder for them to dry out if they do get wet.
Yeah.
And on older buildings, they also would be in contact with the concrete instead of having a capillary break.
Sure.
And so, again, going back to Joe Stiebrick, on his own house, he had, which was an old 19th century house, I believe, with solid sill beams sitting right on the stone foundation. He actually had his contractors jack up the house incrementally and do... I think they did like ice and water or something similar as a capillary break to keep some of the moisture absorption down on the frame.
So,
members.
Tom, if you don't have a sill seal layer, you're going to want to jack up your house and put something in there.
That sounds
Yeah.
inexpensive.
Yeah,
And easy.
I mean, that's another reason why you kind of find a happy medium. Like if you're putting just a couple inches of EPS foam in there that could potentially dry to the interior and isn't making it a super insulated structure, you've got some warmth getting in there and some ability for it to dry to the inside.
I would want to know if it's getting wet now, and you can only test that with a moisture meter. Most of the ones you can buy, the consumer grade ones for like under $100 are kind of crappy, but if it's worth it enough to you, you spend $100 and buy a Delmhorst meter and check to see that it's not soaking wet, and that'll tell you if you have an issue.
I think you should be a brick inspector.
Me?
Yeah. I feel like you get into it. Wet brick.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, but I mean, you bring up a really good point that should have been mentioned from the start, is that anytime you're working in a basement, the first thing you want to do is to see what the existing conditions are as far as moisture goes, especially since they're stripping it down to the foundation.
Yeah, totally.
It'll be
and I would
easier to do
want to
that.
monitor the humidity of the air also. And you also need to spend some money to get a decent hygrometer to keep track of that. So start with some data before we plunge into things. I think that's a good rule. Paul from Memphis writes, I've been a listener, even advocate of the podcast for many months now. Even got my wife to listen to the design discussion a few episodes back, and she didn't roll her eyes at all. So thanks. I lead a job training program in construction at Binghamton Development Corporation in Memphis, Zone 2. We work in a neighborhood of historically high unemployment, crime, poverty, etc. Our training program uses old and new residential building projects as vehicles for both hard and soft job skills training. We hire men from our neighborhood and train them on real job sites 4 days a week for 6 months. Along the way, we try to get their tape measuring down to 1/16 of an inch, teach them the basics of carpentry in real-world settings, and when they graduate, endorse them into careers in the industry.
So awesome.
Yeah, right? As a builder and trainer, my question for you is, how do you build a fine home really, really, really affordably? I know it's the Fine Homebuilding podcast or the Air Sealing podcast, not necessarily the Affordable Homebuilding podcast. What ways can we do both? Attached is a 1,500 square foot house we've built and are planning to build again. An amazing architect, Brad Shapiro, has drawn up the plans for us with the specific goals of affordability and training. We will do the hardy siding, all trim, insulation, help with concrete, and maybe do the framing on this job. Everything else will be subbed out. Okay. Cute little house.
Yeah.
Super practical, using a lot of the vernacular architecture tools that older homes from this area use with porches and what have you.
What about get rid of the dormer? That would save money.
It looks really cute, though.
It does.
And I mean,
it does.
As we said before, ugly houses don't last.
It wouldn't be ugly without it. I only
cute.
say that because
I just wonder if it's living space.
yeah, usually I always think of them as
Fake.
useless, but just to punch light, just for light.
You know, it's funny. There's a little house in my neighborhood that has a hip roof that looks. I'm up in downtown New England town in Connecticut, but this house looks like it's something you'd see on like the Carolina coast, with one little dormer on the top, one little shed dormer on the top. And I haven't been inside the house yet, but it's a friend of a friend, and they have apparently a whole master suite up there. And it's funny how sometimes it's deceiving. You look at a house with a tiny little dormer like that, and it doesn't look like with a low hip roof, and I think in this neighborhood where these people build these little cottages, that they probably need to keep that.
It is a cute house. He has some specs here, and this will help us inform how we could lower costs, right? Our neighborhood is predominantly monolithic slab on grade, so sealed concrete floors and maybe LVT or carpet in some rooms. Rafters versus trusses. We're planning rafters. Extra time is less of a cost to us than equipment. And trusses, plus it would be an opportunity to watch Larry Hahn's videos, which we watch for basic framing. We changed the roof pitch to 712 from 812 to have 20-foot instead of 22-foot rafters, which were double the cost. So that's one thing. The lumber yard I worked for, and I know it's not the case everywhere, but we stocked 2x10s and 2x12s up to 24 feet, and they were the same board foot price. So it might be worth just calling around. Up here we have those huge length 2x12s and 2x10s because we have need a lot of cavity insulation for cathedral ceilings. So that was why they're so mainstream. So I think you might I don't know if it's worth it, but you could maybe get those more affordably. He asks, should we use 2x6s on 24-inch centers or 2x4 at 16-inch centers? I think 2x6s at 24 are great. I would still put foam insulation on the exterior if the budget allowed. Zipper Tyvek, 7/16 zip on walls, regular OSB on the roof. Huber has a $1,500 rebate for first-time users in 2019. I would totally take advantage of that just for the air barrier.
Yeah.
He asked what kind of insulation. Bats are really the only way to do any of these things yourself. Cellulose requires professional installation and special equipment, as does spray foam. So I think if you do an amazing job of air sealing, and I would, if you guys could, invest in a blower door and teach these folks how to use it. You're talking about fine home building. I don't think that always means materials or aesthetics. I think it's about quality construction. So teach them how to use the blower door, and it's like the most important diagnostic tool they will ever know how to use, for sure.
And that'll give them a extra
leg
skill.
up, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Uncased openings, drywall returns and windows. Personally, I loathe all things drywall. I mean, does anyone ever wax nostalgic about drywall like they would about wood or steel? I much prefer cased openings for aesthetics and training opportunities, but this does save a few bucks. We did that in my Habitat project as well. Do you guys have any other suggestions to maximize affordability, training, and building performance? I'm going to say a couple things, and I hope you guys will take it from there, but focus on doing a good job, tight joints, good building. Like, that's fine home building no matter what the budget is. And that's like, if your trainees can be left alone and not have to be babysat, like, they're a valuable asset for their employer, and they're going to command more money for themselves. So, God, teach them to do a good job.
Yeah,
teach them to not do stuff without asking. How many times do you go back to somebody you've left in charge of something, and they say, "Well, I thought you wanted me to do this." Like, well, you should have thought to ask me what I wanted you to do, not what you thought I wanted, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and as far as, like you said, fine home building doesn't necessarily mean extravagant budgets. It just means quality over quantity. So it's like you might want to, in some of the less important spaces, cut corners with like fancy trim or something like that, just so you can spend a little extra money on a really nice front door. Just like figure out where it makes the most sense to spend things to have the quality that people experience on a daily basis when they're living in that house.
But that doesn't mean cut the craftsmanship aspect.
No, certainly not quality of construction, but basically where you don't see aesthetic details, you can probably Like my house, for example, built in the 1870s, the living room has the most extravagant trim in the house, and you get to the back of the house and it's just 1x3 boards.
Yeah.
And so it's like, just sort of put its best face, forward. So it's like not actually reducing the quality, but basically focusing on making a statement with quality details where it matters the most.
What do you think about this?
I was wondering if there are any opportunities for him to use some recycled materials.
That seems like a great idea.
I don't know if that is available to him, but it's at least, like, for instance, the exterior foam. I mean, that seems like something that you might be able to get.
Yeah, sure.
Rigid foam.
So you're referring to like the reclaimed rigid insulation we often talk about.
Yeah.
Like that'd be a great thing to start doing. And like air sealing measures, like if you can train these folks into high performance construction, they're going to have a leg up on almost all the other people who they're competing against trying to get construction jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really
And
good
I don't see it going away even in places like Alabama where it's warmer and it's less of an issue. But the building code has ratcheted up in recent years, and for folks who aren't ready, it's going to be tough to get houses certificates of occupancy.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, going towards the salvage material thing, I mean, basically, what is it? Habitat has those restores everywhere,
Yeah.
and you can find a lot of great materials
Totally.
in those. It's stuff that's like leftover from builders, and you might even want to go directly to the source. You might want to find, local building supply companies that might have some slightly damaged stuff that you could salvage pieces out of, or a local builder who might have, especially for a program like theirs where they're doing this for a good cause.
Yeah.
Maybe you could even get some
Donations.
stuff donated.
donations for sure.
Yeah, Paul, we would get bum material at the lumber yard that I worked at. One time we got a truckload of plywood that was cut out of square. And nobody else wanted that, and the mill didn't want to take it back. And I don't remember what we did with it, but I mean, that stuff happens more often than you'd imagine. And windows get misordered, and make relationships with your suppliers and tell them, hey, we're trying to build these things as inexpensively as possible. Keep us in mind when you get something weird, and maybe you can make a deal, and that would help everybody.
Especially since he makes a clear point that labor is his lowest expense, because the whole point is to give these people experience doing the work. So if you find an opportunity, maybe it's even with a local mill that's got some wood, you maybe do some interesting trim details. I mean, this house has like smooth paint grade trim on it, but maybe you just change some of the aesthetics of some of the interior, maybe do something in the kitchen, a nice paneled wall out of some rough sawn tongue and groove or something like that.
And that costs almost nothing, really.
Yeah.
And sometimes it leads to details that are they have some value to them in terms of selling, right?
Sure.
Because they're custom.
Even if it doesn't like affect the appraisal, it means like someone wants the house versus maybe they don't.
Right.
Like, oh, that's really cool.
I really like this one thing about it. Yeah.
Yeah. One other thing that I think a place where he should look for some inspiration, I'm sure you guys have heard of that 20K initiative, the Auburn University in Alabama.
What's he talking about?
It's part of their architecture school program there, and one of their professors and a bunch of their students years ago started this thing where they saw the need for affordable housing, and they challenged themselves to be able to build with student labor.
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking
these
about.
really simple vernacular architecture sort of inspired little bungalows for under $20,000.
There's lots of examples of them, yeah.
They're certainly very simple homes, but because they focus on the details, they're just beautiful, timeless little houses, and they build them for less than $20,000.
Yep. And then actual people buy them and have them, and you can see them on their site. Yeah, it's really inspiring.
So he might even reach out to them, because their whole goal is to spread that concept. So I'm sure they'd be perfectly happy to give him some ideas.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with that, Paul. It seems like an awesome program. And you and anyone else who wants to give us feedback on our advice, we'd love to hear.
Didn't Brian do a story about that program?
I think he did.
I think he did too. I'll find it.
Do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Hello. Eric. This is from Eric. I was given a subscription to Fine Homebuilding magazine last Christmas and have been very impressed by the quality of the publication. More recently, I found the podcast and feel like I cannot listen to them fast enough. I love how everything is explained, that most topics are covered from multiple viewpoints. My question is about the part of DIY that scares me the most, the permitting process. I know permitting varies by region. I'm in Portland, Oregon, but I think my worries are probably broad enough to be covered by an expert in any region. I'm taking on a remodel on a foreclosed home that was empty for several years. I'm working with an engineer on plans to remove a load-bearing wall, but currently there are a few smaller items I would like to tackle while I wait. My fear with permitting is what happens after I complete individual pieces which need to be inspected and the rest of the house is a mess. Can you shed some light on when the city would give you a stop work order? I'm also interested in best practices for DIYers wanting to make sure everything is compliant. So,
I'm not sure you guys are the one to ask.
I'm saying that. Yeah. Eric, you're asking the wrong guy. Talk to your inspector.
Yeah.
It's like there's one answer to this. And this is not something that's unusual.
No.
There are oftentimes they have to come out multiple times to look at something before you can close up the walls. It's just the nature of the beast. It's not going to be anything out of the ordinary for them.
But I mean, I can totally know what he's feeling, because I mean, I live in an old house in a downtown that's non-conforming because of setbacks, and there's like, I always stress out about projects. I mean, if I lived out in the country somewhere where I had all this space and it was just easier to meet the local codes, I would certainly be, go ahead and do it. But the
That's not what I'm saying.
but the thing is, as Glenn Mathewson, who came to our summit recently, pointed out, he's like, the goal here is to help people make their buildings safe. They're not there to
They're not
chastise
cops.
you.
Yes.
Right.
And so certainly different building officials are going to have different attitudes and different styles and different requirements, but really you start by asking them what you need to do. And it's like, so you go in there in a very non-confrontational way, in a very comfortable way, and just make it very clear that your goal is to do things right and safe, and ask for their guidance.
And look for the right guy, because based on Glenn's talk, you don't want the buttoned up with the clipboard and the scowl on his face.
You
right?
can never tell, though, because that is not a good indicator.
You can't judge the book by its cover.
Yeah. I would say do your homework before you go in to know exactly what you want to do with this house, have pictures of problem areas or things you're concerned about, and go in ready like you know what you're doing. And if you have confidence that what you're doing is right and you have a reasonable plan for the work to get done, they're going to recognize that and they're going to help you any way they can. If they suspect you have no idea what you're doing, you're going to have a lot more difficulty, I'm sure.
Now, I don't know if this is too rudimentary for him, but I did find that the Portland Bureau of Developmental Services has put together some guidelines and a really good, seemingly, resource list and a series of what they call handouts to address some of those issues that he's concerned about. And there's like this series of like 15 or 20 different handouts that you can get online, and they talk about residential permits and inspiration.
Can you say that website again? Because their site was pretty good.
PortlandOregon.gov,
and it was the development office, right?
Yes.
Which is
Did you look
varies
at it too?
by, it varies by municipality what they call it. So that's where you want to go to on the city page.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
just seemed like there was a lot to be had if you start digging around in there.
The first part of any of this is the permit application.
Right.
That's going to be who you are, where the project is located, what
Yeah.
it's going to cost, and that's going to be part of the process no matter where you fill out an application for a building permit. So if you can get it online and have it filled out when you go in there, you're going to be ahead of the game. They're going to see you as somebody who's trying to do the right thing and doing your homework instead of making them do it.
And I don't know if this exists anywhere else, but in my town, there's actually a person who has a business expediting permits for contractors. And this comes from when the building market was booming and the builders didn't have time to be running to the office all the time. And I mean, you might be able to find somebody like that who would be knowledgeable about the process, but isn't the actual building inspector themselves. But I did go on that Portland website, and it's going to vary from, like you said, from town to town, how detailed the information is, but it's pretty complete. Like, all the instructions about what's required and what type of permits you're going to need for different types of projects.
Keep in mind, this is government, so
this is Portland,
and the rules are spelled out
Oregon,
in government, or should be. You know what I mean? Like, that's what government does, is open to sunshine laws. So the permitting process and the application process are all supposed to be very transparent. So it shouldn't be a thing where you need to know someone to get something done. It does help. We're running out of time. I just wanted to show you guys something. So every year I go to the Connecticut Antique Machinery Association Fall Festival, which is my happy place.
You do.
This museum, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I suspect it's most of you, has a collection of industrial steam engines. These were stationary engines with huge flywheels that powered the early industry in our area and other parts of the country. And every year they
Including
have
California?
Probably California is too new.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to get a California shout out in there.
Oh my gosh, we have to try harder. So anyway, I go up to this, and they have a bunch of vendors selling junk and all kinds of stuff, tractor parts. And I came across this electrical appliance, and I know it's in there. Anyway, it's a hairdryer, and what's notable about it is it's so early that it doesn't have a plug on it. It screws into a lamp socket, and I just thought it was awesome. I was tempted to buy it, but it looked also insanely dangerous. So,
You think?
Did you figure out how old it was?
so I went looking to determine when like plugs and receptacles came to be, because that's the question, right? And it's like the 1830s is when this stuff got like kind of standardized. So I couldn't believe it was that early to have a hairdryer, but it makes sense.
So you really think that hairdryer is from the 1830s?
I don't know.
That sounds. So I did a little bit of.
Why do you think they would not have had hairdryers?
Well,
no,
electrical
no.
appliances are more of a not 20th century
Yeah.
thing.
I did, because I did some research to try to figure out what the oldest appliance was. I mean, lighting was obviously first, right? But supposedly, according to several different sources, the earliest electrical appliance, what would you think it was?
Lights, of course.
Well, after lighting,
Fans.
a toaster.
Makes sense to me.
And yes, like one was made in the
Really?
1890s.
Toast over
Yeah.
breeze? Surprising.
I don't know. I mean, who knows? Maybe these people are pulling our legs, but it seemed like there were multiple sources that said that the first appliance after lighting was a
I bet
toaster.
clothes irons were pretty soon too, because like heating an iron in your wood stove would have been a big drag. I'm
When
sure.
did washing machines come along?
Not soon enough. I think that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Rob, Kiley, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. Please include a mailing address so we can send you a Fine Homebuilding podcast sticker if we answer your question on the air. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Thanks again. Happy building.